Nathan Reynolds watched in amazement as his 8-year-old son Connor, who hadn't spoken to anyone in months, was quietly drawing alongside a tired-looking waitress at Blue Moon Diner. The woman had paint-stained fingers and wore a faded uniform, but somehow she had accomplished what dozens of expensive therapists couldn't. She had reached his autistic son. Connor was actually smiling, pointing at a simple sketch on a napkin, his usual anxiety completely gone. The other customers had stopped eating, mesmerized by this unexpected moment of connection. Nathan studied the waitress more closely. Her gentle movements, her patient expression, the way she seemed to understand Connor's silent language. Then he noticed something that made his breath catch. Hidden beneath her sleeve was a small tattoo, barely visible but unmistakable. It was the same symbol his late wife, Jessica, used to draw, the same one from her art therapy sessions. Nathan's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, his mind racing with impossible questions. What he decided to do next would shock everyone in that small-town diner, including the waitress who had no idea her life was about to change forever. Frank Morrison had owned Blue Moon Diner for 23 years, and in all that time, he'd never seen anything quite like what was happening at Table 7. The Reynolds kid, who usually spent his Sunday mornings having meltdowns that sent other families packing, was sitting perfectly still, completely absorbed in whatever Maya Thompson was showing him. Frank wiped down the same coffee mug for the 3rd time, watching as his best waitress worked her quiet magic on the troubled boy. Maya had been working at the diner for 8 months now, ever since she'd moved to Cedar Falls from God knows where, carrying nothing but a beat-up suitcase and a heart full of secrets she never shared. She was different from the other girls who came and went. Quieter, more thoughtful, with an artist's eye that caught details others missed. Frank had noticed how she always lingered near the children's drawings taped to the wall, studying them with the intensity of someone who understood their deeper meaning. Nathan Reynolds was Cedar Falls' most famous resident, though he'd never asked for the attention that came with building a tech empire worth $3 billion. 2 years ago, a drunk driver had stolen everything that mattered to him: his wife Jessica, Connor's speech, and the boy's connection to the world around him. The accident had left Connor with brain injuries that doctors said would heal, but the autism that followed seemed permanent, a wall between father and son that no amount of money could tear down. Nathan had tried everything: the best specialists from Boston, experimental therapies from Switzerland, even a live-in behavioral expert who lasted exactly 3 days before Connor's screaming drove her away. The boy who once chatted about dinosaurs and drew pictures of their family now lived in silence, communicating only through tantrums and tears that broke Nathan's heart a little more each day. Every Sunday morning, Nathan brought Connor to Blue Moon Diner, hoping the familiar routine might spark some flicker of the happy child his son used to be. It was their ritual, born from desperation and maintained through stubborn hope: chocolate chip pancakes for Connor, black coffee for Nathan, and the same corner booth where Jessica used to sketch while they ate. The other families had learned to avoid their table, uncomfortable with Connor's outbursts and Nathan's helpless attempts to manage them. But today felt different. Today Connor hadn't cried once, hadn't thrown his fork or hidden under the table when a stranger walked too close. Instead, he was leaning forward, completely focused on the simple drawing Maya was creating, with a worn pencil stub and boundless patience. Maya Thompson had learned long ago that sometimes the most broken children could only be reached through silence and understanding, not words and forced smiles. She'd recognized the signs immediately when she first saw Connor 3 months ago: the repetitive movements, the sensory overload, the desperate need for predictability in an unpredictable world. Her own brother Danny had been the same way before the therapies and medications helped him find his voice. But Danny was gone now, lost to a war that took more than just soldiers, and Maya carried his memory in every gentle gesture she offered to children who reminded her of him. She'd started bringing her sketchbook to work, filling spare moments with drawings that somehow found their way to the kids who needed them most. Connor was special, though. Something about his eyes reminded her of Danny's quiet intelligence, the way he processed the world differently, but not incorrectly. The drawing Maya was creating wasn't fancy or complicated, just a simple bird with outstretched wings flying toward a bright sun. But she'd learned that sometimes the most powerful images were also the most basic, symbols that spoke to something deeper than conscious thought. Connor's breathing had steadied as she worked, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since they'd entered the diner. When she handed him the pencil and gestured towards the napkin, he didn't pull away like he usually did when strangers tried to engage with him. Instead, he took the pencil with careful fingers and began adding his own marks to her drawing, small, deliberate strokes that transformed her simple bird into something uniquely his own. Maya felt tears prick her eyes, remembering how Danny used to do the same thing, taking her sketches and making them better, making them theirs. Nathan couldn't breathe as he watched his son interact with another human being for the first time in 18 months. The last person Connor had willingly engaged with was Jessica. In those final weeks before the accident, when she was working on her art therapy certification, dreaming of opening a center for special needs children, Nathan still kept her sketchbooks in Connor's room, filled with drawings of butterflies and flowers and hopeful tomorrows that would never come. The symbol he'd glimpsed on Maya's wrist was Jessica's signature mark, a small infinity loop intertwined with a heart, something she'd developed as her therapeutic logo. It was impossible that this waitress would know that symbol, impossible that she'd be using the same gentle techniques Jessica had studied for years, but impossible things seemed to be the theme of this surreal Sunday morning, and Nathan found himself believing in possibilities he'd given up months ago. When Maya excused herself to handle other customers, Connor didn't retreat into his shell like Nathan expected. Instead, the boy continued drawing on the napkin, his movements confident and purposeful in a way Nathan hadn't seen since before the accident. Other diners were starting to notice, the elderly couple at table 3, the family with twin girls near the window, even Frank Morrison, who'd emerged from behind the counter to get a better view. Word traveled fast in a town of 8,000 people, and by the time Maya returned with fresh coffee, half the diner was pretending not to watch the miracle unfolding at the corner booth. Nathan's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant, reminding him about a conference call with investors from Tokyo, but he silenced it without reading the details. For the first time in 2 years, there was something more important than business, more precious than the empire he'd built to distract himself from grief. Maya slipped back into the booth across from Connor, and the boy immediately pushed his drawing towards her with a shy smile that nearly stopped Nathan's heart. She studied the napkin artwork with the seriousness of a museum curator, nodding and pointing to specific details as if Connor had just unveiled a masterpiece. The conversation was wordless but somehow profound, two artists communicating in a language Nathan didn't speak but desperately wanted to learn. When Connor reached across the table and briefly touched Maya's hand, Nathan felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking, but healing, like ice finally beginning to thaw after the longest winter. The moment was so fragile and perfect that he was afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to do anything that might shatter this unexpected gift his son was giving them both. But as Nathan studied Maya more closely, questions began forming in his mind that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with suspicion. Her movements around Connor were too practiced, too knowing, like someone who'd worked with autistic children before. The art supplies she'd casually pulled from her apron weren't standard waitress equipment. They were professional-grade materials, expensive tools that suggested serious artistic training. And that symbol on her wrist, the one that matched Jessica's drawings perfectly, couldn't possibly be a coincidence. Cedar Falls was a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, but Maya Thompson remained a mystery 8 months after her arrival. No one knew where she'd come from, why she'd chosen their little corner of Iowa, or why someone with her obvious talents was content to serve coffee and pie for minimum wage. Nathan's instincts, honed by years of making billion-dollar decisions based on incomplete information, were telling him there was much more to his son's unlikely guardian angel than met the eye. The weeks that followed brought changes Nathan had never dared to hope for, as Connor began emerging from the shell he'd built around himself since the accident. Maya had become a regular fixture in their lives, visiting their house twice a week to work with Connor on art projects that seemed to unlock something vital in his damaged brain. She brought supplies from her own collection, watercolors and pastels, sketchbooks and clay, materials that Connor handled with the reverence of sacred objects. His bedroom walls, once blank and sterile as a hospital room, now bloomed with colorful creations that spoke of an inner world far richer than anyone had imagined. Connor still didn't speak in full sentences, but he'd started using single words again. And more importantly, he'd begun reaching out to touch and be touched, small gestures that felt like massive victories to his grateful father. Maya refused to accept payment for her time with Connor, insisting that helping him was its own reward. But Nathan found other ways to show his appreciation. He arranged for her work schedule at the diner to be flexible, covering her shifts when Connor needed extra attention. He upgraded her ancient Honda with a reliable Toyota that wouldn't leave her stranded on winter roads, claiming it was a safety concern for someone who spent so much time with his son. When he noticed her studio apartment lacked proper lighting for her artwork, he had an electrician install professional-grade fixtures while she was at work, brushing off her protests with the explanation that Connor needed adequate illumination for their projects. Each gesture was met with initial resistance, followed by reluctant acceptance, as if Maya was unused to kindness, but learning to trust it cautiously, like a stray animal discovering that not all humans meant harm. The attraction between Nathan and Maya grew slowly, built on shared concern for Connor and quiet moments when their hands would accidentally touch over art supplies or coffee cups. Nathan found himself looking forward to Maya's visits with an anticipation that had nothing to do with his son's progress and everything to do with her gentle presence in their too-quiet house. She had a way of moving through rooms that brought them to life, humming softly as she worked, laughing at Connor's artistic choices, bringing warmth to spaces that had felt cold since Jessica's death. Maya seemed equally drawn to Nathan, stealing glances when she thought he wasn't looking, blushing when he complimented her work with Connor, lingering in conversations that could have ended much sooner. But she also carried an invisible barrier around herself, a carefulness that suggested she was protecting secrets too dangerous to share with anyone, no matter how much she might want to trust them. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening when Connor had his first major setback since Maya entered their lives, triggered by a thunderstorm that sent him into the kind of meltdown Nathan thought were behind them. Maya arrived within minutes of Nathan's desperate phone call, still wearing her diner uniform and carrying a bag of art supplies like a medic's emergency kit. She found Connor huddled in his closet, rocking and humming with the intensity that meant he'd disappeared completely into his internal world, unreachable by conventional means. Without hesitation, Maya crawled into the small space beside him, not trying to comfort him with words or touch, but simply being present, steady and calm in the midst of his storm. She began sketching on a piece of paper torn from Connor's notebook, her pencil moving in rhythm with his rocking, creating images that somehow matched the tempo of his distress and gradually, almost imperceptibly, began to slow it down. Nathan watched from the doorway, amazed and humbled by Maya's intuitive understanding of his son's needs as she guided Connor back to himself through nothing more than shared artistic creation. When the boy finally lifted his head and met Maya's eyes, she smiled and handed him the pencil, inviting him to add to her drawing in the way that had become their special language. Connor took the pencil with shaking hands and made a single mark on the paper, a small heart in the corner of Maya's sketch, barely visible but profound in its simplicity. It was the first time he'd drawn anything representational since the accident, and Nathan felt tears he couldn't control streaming down his face as he witnessed his son's return to symbolic thinking. Maya looked up and caught Nathan's expression, and something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words or careful boundaries, an acknowledgement that they were no longer just Connor's support team, but something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to a family. Later that evening, after Connor had finally fallen asleep clutching the drawing he and Maya had created together, Nathan found her in the kitchen, staring out the window at the storm with an expression of profound sadness. He made coffee without asking if she wanted any, setting a mug beside her with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd learned her preferences through careful observation. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain and the house settling around them, sharing the peace that comes after weathering a crisis together. When Maya finally spoke, her voice was soft and heavy with emotion she'd been holding back for months. She told him about Danny, her younger brother who'd been autistic and brilliant and beautiful, who'd joined the army despite everyone's warnings and died in Afghanistan 3 years ago, leaving Maya alone with grief too large for her small apartment and minimum wage existence to contain. The story poured out of Maya like water through a broken dam, weeks of careful restraint, finally giving way under the weight of Nathan's patient attention and Connor's innocent trust. She'd been Danny's caregiver since their parents died in a car accident when she was 21 and he was 15, learning about autism and art therapy and unconditional love through trial and error and desperate research. Danny had been her world, her purpose, her reason for everything she did, and when he died, she'd lost not just her brother, but her identity as his protector and advocate. She'd drifted for months after the funeral, unable to settle anywhere that didn't remind her of him, until she'd ended up in Cedar Falls purely by accident, her car breaking down outside Frank Morrison's diner on a day when he happened to need a waitress. She'd stayed because the town was small enough to hide in and large enough to disappear, working jobs that required no emotional investment and forming relationships that demanded no vulnerability. But Connor had changed everything. She admitted, his needs awakening something in her that she'd thought died with Danny, a purpose she'd never expected to feel again. Working with Nathan's son had brought her back to life in ways she was still trying to understand, giving her days meaning and her nights hope for the first time since the military chaplain had knocked on her door with news that shattered her world. She loved Connor, she said, with a fierceness that scared her, because she knew how much it hurt to lose someone you loved, and she was terrified of caring too much again, only to have it ripped away by circumstances beyond her control, and she was falling in love with Nathan too. She whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain, which was even more terrifying because it meant risking not just her heart, but Connor's emotional stability, and she couldn't bear the thought of hurting the little boy who'd already survived too much loss for someone his age. Nathan reached across the table and took Maya's hands in his, feeling the paint stains and calluses that spoke of artistic dedication and honest work, marveling at how perfectly her fingers fit between his own. He told her about Jessica, about the plans they'd made for the art therapy center, about the guilt he carried for surviving when his wife hadn't, for being unable to reach Connor when the boy needed him most. He admitted that he'd been attracted to Maya from their first meeting at the diner, drawn not just to her beauty, but to her kindness, her authenticity in a world full of people who wanted things from him because of his money. But he'd been afraid too, afraid of betraying Jessica's memory, afraid of giving Connor hope that might be taken away again, afraid of loving someone who might decide that a damaged man and his broken son were too much trouble for any reasonable person to handle. The storm outside was weakening, its fury spent, but the emotional tempest between Nathan and Maya was just beginning. Years of careful boundaries dissolving in the face of honesty too powerful to contain. Their first kiss happened naturally, inevitably, as storms passed and coffee grew cold, and two people who'd been protecting their hearts finally decided that some risks were worth taking. Maya tasted like coffee and tears and possibilities Nathan had given up imagining. And when she pulled back to look into his eyes, he saw his own hope reflected there, fragile but real. They talked until dawn, sharing stories and fears and dreams, building trust brick by careful brick, creating the foundation for something that might last if they were brave enough to tend it properly. When Connor wandered into the kitchen the next morning, rubbing sleep from his eyes and looking for breakfast, he found them at the table, surrounded by empty coffee cups and art supplies, working together on a drawing that looked suspiciously like the three of them under a bright sun. And his delighted giggle was the most beautiful sound either adult had heard in years. The happiness lasted exactly 3 months before everything fell apart in the most unexpected way possible, starting with a phone call that changed Maya's life forever and shattered the fragile peace she'd built in Cedar Falls. The caller was a lawyer from Chicago, informing her that her brother Danny had been posthumously awarded a significant settlement from the military contractor whose faulty equipment had contributed to his death overseas. The amount was staggering, $500,000, enough to pay off debts she'd accumulated during his final years, enough to start the art therapy practice she'd always dreamed of, enough to build a life worthy of Danny's memory. But there was a catch. There was always a catch, and this one came in the form of a mandatory appearance at a settlement hearing in Chicago, where Maya would be required to provide testimony about Danny's condition and care, testimony that would inevitably reveal the depth of her experience with autism and art therapy, experience she'd carefully hidden from everyone in Cedar Falls, including Nathan. The truth was that Maya Thompson wasn't just a waitress with a natural gift for helping special needs children. She was a licensed art therapist with a master's degree from Northwestern University, professionally trained and legally certified to practice in 3 states. She'd worked at Chicago's premier pediatric hospital before Danny's death, earning recognition for her innovative techniques with autistic children, building a reputation that could have led to academic positions or private practice opportunities that most therapists could only dream about. But when Danny died, she'd walked away from it all, unable to face other people's children when she'd failed to save the one who mattered most, consumed by guilt over her decision to support his military service instead of fighting to keep him safe at home. The credentials were still valid, the knowledge still intact, but Maya had buried them along with her professional identity, choosing the anonymity of minimum wage work over the responsibility of caring for vulnerable children who might remind her too much of the brother she'd lost. Nathan discovered Maya's secret in the worst possible way. Through a background check his security team ran when they noticed unusual activity around Connor's medical records, activity that suggested someone with professional credentials was accessing files they shouldn't have been able to see. The report landed on his desk 3 days before Maya was supposed to leave for Chicago, 20 pages of documentation that revealed not just her educational background and professional history, but also her financial struggles, her brother's military service, and her complete psychological profile from the hospital where she'd worked before Danny's death. Nathan stared at the papers with growing disbelief and rage, feeling betrayed not by what Maya had done, but by what she'd hidden, by the careful deception she'd maintained while he'd opened his heart and his home to her influence. Every moment of their relationship suddenly felt suspect. Had she targeted Connor specifically? Did she see Nathan's wealth as an opportunity? Was their entire romance nothing more than an elaborate con game designed to gain access to his resources? The confrontation happened in Nathan's study, behind closed doors while Connor napped upstairs, unaware that the 2 adults he'd grown to love were about to destroy everything he'd gained over the past 6 months. Nathan threw the background check report across his desk, scattering the pages between them like evidence in a criminal trial, his voice shaking with anger as he demanded explanations Maya wasn't prepared to give. She tried to defend herself, to explain about Danny and the guilt and the fear of caring too much again, but her words sounded like excuses even to her own ears, and Nathan's expression grew colder with each attempt at justification. He accused her of using Connor as a means to an end, of manipulating a grieving father's desperation for her own purposes, of building their relationship on lies and hidden agendas that made everything they'd shared feel false and calculated. Maya's temper finally broke under the weight of accusations that cut too close to her deepest fears about herself, and she fired back with equally harsh words about Nathan's inability to trust anyone, his assumption that money made him a target for every person who entered his life, his arrogance in thinking that she would need to deceive him to get what she wanted from their relationship. She told him that she'd never asked for anything from him, never wanted his money or his status or anything beyond the chance to help Connor heal, and if he was too paranoid and bitter to recognize genuine care when it was offered freely, then maybe she'd been wrong about the man she thought she'd fallen in love with. The argument escalated until they were both saying things they couldn't take back, words chosen specifically to wound, accusations designed to justify the fear they both felt about caring too much for someone who might leave them as alone as they'd been before they found each other. The silence after their fight was deafening, filled with the weight of damaged trust and wounded pride. Two people who'd found something beautiful together, now staring across a divide that felt unbridgeable. Nathan's face was stone as he told Maya that Connor had been through enough trauma and didn't need the confusion of losing another important person from his life, that it would be better for everyone if she left Cedar Falls and pursued whatever opportunities the settlement money would provide in Chicago or anywhere else she chose to go. Maya's response was equally cold, agreeing that Connor deserved stability and consistency, things she apparently couldn't provide given her track record of abandoning situations when they became too difficult or emotionally demanding. She gathered her art supplies from around the house with mechanical precision, loading them into boxes like evidence being removed from a crime scene, while Nathan watched from the doorway with an expression she couldn't read and didn't want to interpret. Connor woke up just as Maya was loading her car, appearing at the front door in his pajamas with the sleepy confusion of a child who'd missed the adult drama that had just reshaped his world. He ran to Maya with the innocent joy he always showed when she arrived, expecting the usual hugs and art projects and gentle attention that had become the foundation of his healing process. Maya knelt down to his level, fighting tears as she tried to explain that she had to go away for a while, using words too complex for his understanding, but tone gentle enough to convey that this goodbye was different from the temporary separations he was used to. Connor's face crumpled as he began to grasp that Maya was leaving him, just like his mother had left, just like everyone he loved eventually left, and his heartbroken wails echoed through the quiet neighborhood as Maya drove away without looking back, her own tears making it difficult to see the road ahead. 3 months passed before Nathan learned the truth about Maya's departure from Chicago, and by then it was almost too late to undo the damage his pride and suspicion had caused to all of their lives. The information came from an unexpected source. Maya's former supervisor at the pediatric hospital, Dr. Rebecca Morrison, who happened to be Frank Morrison's daughter, and had returned to Cedar Falls for her father's retirement party at Blue Moon Diner. Rebecca had heard about Maya's work with Connor through the small-town gossip network and sought out Nathan to tell him what really happened during Maya's final months in Chicago, a story that painted Maya's actions in a completely different light than the cold facts in the background check report had suggested. Maya hadn't just walked away from her career because of grief. She'd been forced out by a hostile administration that blamed her for Danny's death, questioning her judgment and fitness to work with vulnerable children when she couldn't even keep her own brother safe from his own dangerous choices. Dr. Morrison explained that Maya had been one of the most talented art therapists she'd ever supervised, with an intuitive gift for reaching children that couldn't be taught in graduate school or learned from textbooks, a natural ability that had made her invaluable to families dealing with autism and other developmental challenges. But Maya's superiors had used Danny's death as an excuse to push out an employee whose methods were too unconventional for their conservative approach, whose success with difficult cases made other therapists look inadequate by comparison, whose refusal to medicate children into compliance challenged the pharmaceutical-friendly protocols that generated more revenue for the hospital. The background check Nathan's security team had obtained was accurate but incomplete, focusing on dates and credentials while ignoring the human cost of Maya's professional destruction, the way institutional politics had conspired to destroy a talented healer's confidence in her own abilities. The settlement money Maya had received wasn't compensation for Danny's death. It was a bribe, Dr. Morrison revealed. Hush money designed to keep Maya from pursuing a wrongful termination lawsuit that would have exposed the hospital's discriminatory practices and potentially cost them millions in damages and reputation. Maya had signed the agreement not because she wanted the money, but because she was too emotionally shattered to fight a legal battle against people who were using her grief as a weapon against her, too exhausted by loss to care about justice or vindication or anything beyond the need to disappear somewhere safe and quiet. She'd used most of the settlement to pay off Danny's medical debts and funeral expenses, keeping just enough to start over somewhere far from the memories and professional connections that had once defined her identity. Nathan felt physically sick as he listened to Dr. Morrison's account of Maya's last days in Chicago, realizing how completely he'd misunderstood her motivations and choices, how his own fear of being used had blinded him to the courage it had taken for her to trust him with even the limited truth she'd shared. Maya hadn't hidden her credentials to deceive him. She'd hidden them to protect herself from exactly the kind of suspicion and judgment he'd shown when he discovered them. The assumption that her professional background made her untrustworthy rather than uniquely qualified to help Connor heal. Every moment of their relationship that he'd questioned after reading the background check suddenly made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of Maya's actual experience rather than his paranoid interpretations. And Nathan realized he'd destroyed something precious because he'd been too scared to believe that someone might love him and Connor for who they were rather than what they represented. The search for Maya began immediately, but tracking down someone who'd spent years learning to disappear wasn't easy, even with Nathan's considerable resources and connections. The trail led through a series of temporary addresses and short-term jobs, a pattern of movement that suggested Maya was still running from something, still unable to settle anywhere long enough to call it home. Nathan hired private investigators and reached out through professional networks, following leads that took him to art therapy practices in Denver, Portland, and Seattle, always arriving weeks or months too late to catch more than stories about a talented woman who'd helped several children make remarkable progress before moving on without explanation. Connor's condition deteriorated with each failed attempt to locate Maya, the boy withdrawing into himself again as he struggled to understand why another important person had vanished from his life, his artwork becoming darker and more chaotic as the months passed without resolution. It was Connor himself who finally provided the key to finding Maya in a drawing he made during one of his increasingly rare creative sessions, a picture of himself and Maya standing beside a building that looked remarkably like the children's hospital where she'd once worked. When Nathan showed the drawing to Dr. Morrison, she recognized the architectural details of a specific wing of the facility, the section where Maya had run her most successful programs with autistic children. Further investigation revealed that Maya had indeed returned to Chicago, not to reclaim her old position, but to volunteer at a free clinic that served families too poor to afford private therapy, working under an assumed name and donating her time to children who reminded her of Connor and Danny and all the young patients she'd left behind when her world collapsed. She was living in a studio apartment above the clinic, barely making enough money to survive, pouring all her energy into healing other people's children while her own heart remained broken and unrepaired. Nathan found Maya on a cold February morning, arriving at the clinic just as she was setting up art supplies for a group session with 5 autistic children whose parents couldn't afford conventional therapy. She looked thinner than he remembered, older, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and unresolved grief. But her smile as she greeted the children was genuine and warm, the same expression Connor had fallen in love with months earlier. Nathan waited in the hallway until the session ended, watching through a window as Maya worked her gentle magic with kids who'd been written off by the system, helping them find their voices through color and shape and creative expression that spoke louder than words ever could. When she finally noticed him standing there, her face went white with shock and something that might have been hope, though she tried to hide it behind a mask of professional composure that couldn't quite conceal her emotional response to his unexpected appearance. Their conversation was awkward at first, formal and careful. 2 people who'd hurt each other deeply, trying to navigate a reunion neither had been prepared for, despite months of longing and regret. Nathan apologized for the background check, for the accusations, for the pride that had made him choose suspicion over trust when Maya had needed his support most. Maya apologized too, for the deception, for running away instead of fighting for their relationship, for letting her fear of abandonment become a self-fulfilling prophecy that cost all 3 of them the family they'd been building together. They talked for hours in a coffee shop near the clinic, sharing stories about the months they'd spent apart, the loneliness and regret and gradual understanding that had come too late to prevent the pain they'd caused each other and Connor. Nathan told Maya about Connor's regression, about the artwork that had grown dark and angry, about the nights when the boy cried for her in his sleep, and asked questions Nathan couldn't answer about why people always left when he needed them most. Maya's composure finally cracked as she listened to the description of Connor's suffering, tears streaming down her face as she realized that her attempt to protect herself from further hurt had inflicted the very trauma on Connor that she'd been trying to avoid. She'd thought leaving would be easier for everyone, that Connor would forget her quickly and move on to form healthier attachments with people who could offer him stability and commitment, but instead she'd repeated the pattern of loss that had already shaped too much of his young life, adding her own abandonment to the list of reasons why he might never learn to trust love again. The reunion was tentative, careful, built on acknowledgement of past mistakes rather than promises about future perfection. But it was real in a way their original relationship had never quite been, grounded in complete honesty rather than partial truths and careful omissions. Maya agreed to return to Cedar Falls, not to resume their romance immediately, but to help Connor heal from the damage her departure had caused, to rebuild the trust that had been broken when she'd chosen flight over fight in the face of Nathan's accusations. Nathan offered her a position as Connor's official art therapist, with proper credentials and compensation and the professional respect she'd been denied in Chicago. But Maya insisted on starting slowly, visiting twice a week until Connor felt secure enough in her presence to risk caring about her again. The process of healing took time, patience, and careful attention to the emotional wounds all 3 of them had sustained during their separation. But gradually the trust began to rebuild, and the love that had never really died started to flourish again. Connor was cautious at first, clinging to Nathan when Maya arrived, and watching her carefully for signs that she might disappear again, but slowly his natural affection for her reasserted itself, and his artwork began to show the bright colors and hopeful themes that had characterized his healing during their early months together. Maya moved back to Cedar Falls permanently, taking a small house near the diner where she could maintain some independence while remaining close enough to be a consistent presence in Connor's life. And Nathan courted her slowly, respectfully, like a man who'd learned the difference between possession and love through the painful experience of losing something precious. 2 years later, on a warm September morning that carried the promise of autumn in its gentle breeze, Cedar Falls witnessed one of the most unusual and heartwarming wedding ceremonies in its 150-year history. Maya Thompson became Maya Reynolds in a simple ceremony at Blue Moon Diner, surrounded by the townspeople who'd watched their love story unfold through triumph and tragedy and hard-won redemption. Connor served as ring-bearer, his confident smile a testament to the healing power of consistent love and artistic expression, and Frank Morrison walked Maya down the aisle while Dr. Rebecca Morrison officiated, bringing the story full circle in the way that small towns specialize in creating. The wedding cake was decorated with fondant figures of the bride, groom, and Connor working on an art project together. And instead of traditional wedding favors, guests received small sketches drawn by Connor himself, each one unique and beautiful in the way that gifts from the heart always are. Nathan's wedding speech was brief but heartfelt, acknowledging that love wasn't always easy or comfortable, but was always worth fighting for when it was real and true, and built on mutual respect rather than need or convenience. Maya's vows included a promise to Connor as well as to Nathan, pledging to be not just a stepmother, but a creative partner, advocate, and friend who would help him navigate the world with confidence and joy. Connor didn't speak during the ceremony, but his artwork displayed throughout the diner told the story of a boy who'd found his voice through color and line and the patient guidance of people who understood that healing comes in many forms, not all of them involving words. The Jessica Reynolds Memorial Art Therapy Center opened 6 months after the wedding, housed in a renovated Victorian mansion on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, equipped with state-of-the-art facilities and staffed by therapists Maya had recruited from programs across the country. The center served children with autism, ADHD, trauma histories, and other challenges that traditional therapy couldn't always reach, offering hope to families who'd been told their children might never improve or communicate or form meaningful connections with others. Maya served as clinical director, bringing the same intuitive understanding that had transformed Connor's life to dozens of other children who needed someone to believe in their potential and help them find their unique ways of expressing themselves in a world that often seemed designed to silence different voices. Connor thrived in his new environment, serving as an unofficial ambassador for the center, welcoming new children with the same patience and acceptance Maya had shown him during his darkest moments. His artwork evolved from simple therapeutic exercises to sophisticated pieces that captured the complex emotions and experiences of childhood with startling clarity and depth. And Maya began documenting his progress as part of a research project on the long-term benefits of art therapy for children with autism. Nathan learned to paint as well, initially to better understand Connor's world, but eventually for the simple joy of creating something beautiful with his hands. And the three of them spent evenings working on collaborative pieces that reflected their growth as a family and their commitment to the healing power of shared creativity. On quiet Sunday mornings, they still visited Blue Moon Diner for chocolate chip pancakes and coffee, sitting in the same booth where their story had begun, surrounded by drawings from center participants and the warm acceptance of a community that had watched them struggle and survive and ultimately triumph over the forces that had tried to tear them apart. Connor would sometimes point to the wall where his first drawing with Maya still hung, faded now but precious, and Maya would tell him about the moment she'd first seen him and known that he was special, that he had gifts the world needed even if it took time and patience to help him share them. Nathan would watch his wife and son together, marveling at the journey that had brought them from that first chaotic morning to this peaceful present, grateful for the courage it had taken all three of them to keep believing in love, even when it seemed impossible to sustain. The story of Maya and Nathan and Connor Reynolds became something of a local legend in Cedar Falls, told and retold in coffee shops and church gatherings and school board meetings, Whenever someone needed to be reminded that broken things could be mended and lost things could be found, and families could be built from the most unlikely combinations of people and circumstances. But for the three people living at the center of the legend, the real magic wasn't in the dramatic moments of crisis and reconciliation, but in the daily choice to show up for each other, to be present and patient and committed to the slow work of healing that happened one conversation, one drawing, one moment of connection at a time. They'd learned that love wasn't a feeling, but a decision, renewed every day through small acts of kindness and understanding, and that the most beautiful art was often the most difficult to create, requiring skill and patience and faith in possibilities that couldn't be seen until they were finally, carefully, lovingly brought into being.